So, because of the German writing that we have for today, you know, what are the names? Freud, Marx. Is this working? Can't get anything to work today. I apologize. Although it's not my fault. All right, is that going up? All right, so let me wrap up our discussion of religious experience. I'm actually going to show, I think, break things up a little bit, show a couple of segments. I think even if you saw them on your own, it's helpful to get a look at personal experiences and their own words with respect to their experiences as it relates to our reading from last time. So we are a little bit behind. We probably won't get to, it's very likely we won't get to Freud today. We'll see. And maybe we won't get through Marx, but I want to finish up this discussion, and I do want to show a little bit of sort of a personal account of religious experience. One from an individual who doesn't have a science background or a background in religion, and another from a scientist, in particular a brain scientist, a neuroanatomist who knows a lot about the brain, and was in fact almost delighted to be experiencing what ended up being a stroke, and that led to, in the language that she uses, even though she's not a religious person, this is Jill Bolte Taylor. Some of you may have even seen her TED Talk on this issue. She uses language that is unmistakably religious, spiritual at the very least, in particular Buddhist, as we'll see. And we'll ask whether or not that the fact that it was a stroke, a purely physical phenomena that led to her experiences, or perhaps with the other example we'll talk about somebody with a cerebral epilepsy, an epileptic fit, whether or not it's relevant that was the causal feature of the experience that they had. So last time we were looking at how it is that one might be able to validate, see as reliable, what we call religious experiences. Alston called religious perception. James, I think, offers a lot of illumination here in a way that's very clear, and I think in a way clearer than Alston, and in a way I think that Alston would ultimately agree. He says this, James does, in his Varieties of Religious Experience, with respect to the first one. These are not necessary or sufficient conditions for a religious experience. This is before Wittgenstein, but James would have agreed with Wittgenstein. These are kind of a family resemblances. We can find that so many religious experiences have these commonalities. And he just lists four, and we'll discuss them briefly. For most of the experiences, they are ineffable. And what does that mean?
You can't describe.
Can't be put into words. Can't be effed. That's not a word.
Can't be effed with.
Can't be effed with, yeah. Yes, don't F with my ineffable.
Yeah.
Damn, that's good. You write it down. My handwriting's so terrible, I'll write it down and I'll look back. What the hell does that say? Is this a problem? This references Alston as well. Here's James on this point. The incommunicableness, that word is itself somewhat incommunicable, incommunicableness of the transport of this religious experience, whatever it might be, is the keynote of all mysticism. And James is talking about mystical beliefs. Alston focuses on religious experience. In fact, he specifically refers to religious perceptual experiences of God. So it's a little bit more of a narrow context for Alston. He just argues that it's a different kind of perception. He even makes the case in another paper, does Alston. We talk about other species having different kinds of perception. Why is it so hard for us to imagine other human beings having different kinds of perception that are non-sensual? Do you see what I mean? It's hard for us to imagine that, I suppose. But it's also hard for us to imagine echolocation. To go back to, if you've taken the contemporary class, we talk about a paper called What Is It Like to Be a Bat? And in that paper, Thomas Nagel discusses, we can only metaphorically speak about the mode of perception that bats have. And then you might say, well, wait a minute, don't we have analogies of this for humans? And what would it be?
Blind as a bat.
Well, yeah, right.
Oh, the Sixth Sense?
No, people who are blind. That's actually not cool. But with the stick, somebody who's walking with a walking stick, a cane, that's echolocation, metaphorically speaking. Actually, literally speaking, it's just not as acute, presumably, as a bat's echolocation. Bats don't have eyes in the way that we do. They bounce off sonar that bounces off objects. Somehow their brain is able to interpret when that signal comes back how large the object is, how close the object is, and so forth. Humans can do this up to a point. Why isn't there a parallel, James and Alston are kind of asking, with respect to religious or theistic perceptions? Go ahead.
I was listening to this podcast and they were talking about this guy who was blind and he was actually like using echolocation.
Could have been sticking his tongue, right?
Yeah, so
Yeah.
like that. And,
Yeah.
Like you could tell like distance by
That's amazing.
the echo.
Yeah. So there we go. Now that's still sensation, right? Here's James. Mystical truth exists for the individual who has the transport, but for no one else. In this, as I have said, it resembles the knowledge given to us in sensations, more than can be given in conceptual thought. Thought, with its remoteness and abstractness, has often enough in the history of philosophy been contrasted unfavorably with sensation. Here's again what we were talking about last time, the subjectivity of a particular sensation with theistic undertones. Alston argues trying to evaluate that from the ground of, or the evidential standard of, sensual perception is epistemic imperialism. It's using this one standard to expand on or explain or cover all these other different modes of perception. Related to this ineffability, though, is potentially a problem. It's almost too, the negative view, and here I think Freud and Marx would both agree, too convenient. What do I mean by that? What would they mean by too convenient? It's ineffable. I can't describe it.
Kind of like because there's no explanation, we're not able to participate in any sense of discourse, and it ends up not really going anywhere.
Yeah? Are there examples of this that aren't necessarily religious?
How do you sense the senseless, I guess, is kind of, it's...
Yeah, sense. We have to be careful with senseless, because that sounds like, nonsense, meaningless. James certainly doesn't want to say that.
No, lack of sense, senseless, less
Right.
sense,
No sensations.
senseless, yeah.
It makes it a lot easier for us to not have a rational explanation for God's existence if he's unknowable in every sense. So
Yeah.
there's no like logical explanation. There's no way to scientifically prove that he exists because he's beyond, science, I guess, beyond reason.
And James says, related to 1 and 2 here, it has a noetic, illuminative quality to the experiences. And as he just quoted, I quoted it here, to the individual. It isn't noetic, it isn't illuminative. Somebody else has a religious experience. That's not illuminative for you necessarily. You have a religious experience, what do? You try to explain it. How do you do it? You get muddled. You say, it was like this, and it was like that. And you lose it's like this and like that. I just quoted a song right there. Who was that?
It's like in that one commercial.
I don't know. You guys don't know. It's hip-hop.
Soul commercial.
I don't know. It doesn't matter.
The banana pancakes song, the blueberry... Jack Johnson.
No.
Yeah.
That's not what it was.
He has a song with those lyrics.
Okay, well, it wasn't that. Sorry. Speaking of music, though, there was a time, years ago, I went to, it was a Rage Against the Machine concert, live concert. I'd never been to a Rage Against the Machine concert. And we're just sitting there waiting. People are standing, milling around. They come out. You familiar with Rage? You get a sense of the kind of music with that name. It's not ballads. It's Rage. And I get chills. I get the hair on the back of my neck is standing up just thinking about it. What happened? They came out. They started rocking, started raging. And within seconds, everyone, in unison, I looked around. How do they all know what to do? Jump up, straight up and down. The whole fucking time. They didn't stop the whole concert. And it was amazing. And there was no extra stuff. I was a responsible person. I didn't need anything else to have what, at least ineffable. I guess I did use words though, didn't I? To explain, but really, that's not telling you anything. I can say, have you been to the Grand Canyon? Because if you haven't, let me explain it to you. It's huge. And grand. And it's just, what am I going to do? The Grand Canyon actually exists. You can go there and experience it firsthand. And in fact, you have to understand it. You look at a picture, you're like, yeah, okay. It looks pretty impressive. Nothing like actually being there. I'm told that's the same. In fact, that is. I think there's something to that with the Mona Lisa. I've seen the Mona Lisa. It's in glass, so that kind of sucks. I wanted to get right up to it and touch it, but you shouldn't do that. There is a little bit of a difference. It's not the same, though. And I haven't seen the Sistine Chapel. I suspect there's something there to it as well. You look at a picture of the Sistine Chapel, very different than walking in and looking up. Has anyone been to the Sistine Chapel? I have not. Am I right? If you look at a picture of it, it's not nearly the same. Words aren't going to F it for you, right? It's not going to be sufficient. And we do this. We have this happen all the time. I come in, I tell you a story. I say, you're not going to believe this. It's hilarious. And then I tell you the story. Nobody laughs. And I say what? I guess you had to be there. Because it was funny. It really happened. If you were there, you would have experienced it too. Here's the problem. You have had experiences like that. You can go to the Sistine Chapel. You can go to the Grand Canyon and say, now I know what Chris was talking about. It is amazing and words aren't enough. Can you have a religious experience that is analogous to that? Because again, we're using this analogy. And notice the difference between the experiences I was just discussing a moment ago. I don't think I gained any deep insight into nature or humanity when I watched the Rage Against the Machine concert. Although Zach De La Rocha is surely Marxist in his philosophy. If you know about Rage Against the Machine,
Band name.
What's that?
It's in the band.
It's kind of in the name. That's right. It's it. And he protests in favor of indigenous populations in Chiapas, and for instance, it's clearly a Marxist critique of society in general, and backed up with some powerful music. But I don't know that I got any of this. What does this mean for James? I was talking with somebody about this after class last time. I know that there's a table in front of me here. But if I have a religious experience, what Teresa experienced of Avila in her situation, she would say, and she does in her own writing, I had knowledge of God's presence and of God's being and goodness. And it was so obvious to me, so clear and illuminating and enlightening. In fact, it was more obviously true to me than that I have a hand in front of my face. That's the noetic quality. It's not just I learned something new. It's I have a deeper insight into reality, to the sacred, that is more obvious and justifiable to me and authoritative on my life than any of my everyday mundane experiences. That's why Teresa goes back to, it says somewhat amusingly, it's going to be tough doing dishes now after having seen the face of God. I mean, that's an amazing thing to have said. And then follow it with, but one should look for God in pots and pans, which is a Buddhist interpretation too, not of a God, but of a kind of serene way of seeing. Sacred may not be the right word for it, but a kind of meditative interpretation, a meditative mindset in everything, in the mundane, in the quotidian. And then they mentions too, James, that they're almost always transient, they're short-lived. Sometimes they happen a lot of times. If you look at the stories of Muhammad, over 23 years he had religious experiences. And they were all very painful, but they were short-lived at the time. They're transient. One, James says something like, one would not be able to survive if they lasted longer than a few moments. And then he says passive. What does that mean? That's important.
It comes at you. Like,
Yes.
you don't it's like happening to you.
Yes.
You're not
Which,
acting on it or something like that.
no, that's it. The problem is, and James is aware of this, that we do put ourselves into a position such that perhaps they can happen. With Muhammad, who I mentioned a moment ago, he would often go off into a cave to fast. What does it mean to fast? To not eat. What oftentimes happens when you don't eat for a long time?
It's pretty psychedelic.
It's pretty psychedelic. Things get a little bit effed. For you, but ineffable to explain to others.
Especially with the weather over there, it's not
And very hot. And so now that's the question that's in the background here. Given that we might have other explanations than that a supernatural intervention is taking place, does that limit? Does that take away? Does that diminish? Is it relevant with respect to our understanding of religious experiences? Question.
Well, I just feel like even
And then
if
there's
you-
more he says. I'm going to just skip through a lot of this, but go on.
Even if you lean towards like a naturalistic explanation of, oh, when you don't eat, these certain chemicals come out, it's, well, what's the explanation behind that? Why is the biology designed in such a way
Oh,
to
right.
facilitate that experience? I mean, it's just to be able to explain something at a physical level isn't to do away with the spiritual effects it may have.
This is James's point. That's exactly what James will say. Even as James himself undergoes, I wouldn't call it a religious experience. It was experimenting with drugs. Actually, do you have that poem he wrote when he was on nitrous oxide?
Not with me, but it's
Oh.
essentially like,
You've committed it to memory.
yeah.
Really?
Uh,
That's surprising.
like,
Do you need
What-
nitrous oxide to remember it? I don't have
what
any.
is nothing but a thing? What is...
This is William James, who we've been
Yeah.
referencing, having taken nitrous oxide for
what-
some reason.
What is, I guess it's just a bunch of these saying like a word and then taking from that word the negation of the word.
Uh-huh.
Um,
And he wrote it down while he was high on nitrous
yeah,
oxide.
yeah, exactly. And then he uses it as an example of like, yeah, like the transiency and also like the like noetic sense, but the fact that then when he looked at it afterwards, he was like, "This is stupid." Like,
Yeah, and so that's, I don't know, maybe that's relevant, maybe it isn't. But, and there you find a distinction, because not all drug-induced highs lead to noetic experiences. As I mentioned with Aldous Huxley, sometimes they end up as a kind of hellish experience. But others, like with Teresa, they have long-lasting, here's James's pragmatic point, it changes their internal structure of living, and we see their change. And so in that sense, it's authoritative to them, and the fact that I'm paying attention to how they have changed, that may affect me, right?
yeah.
Oh, go ahead.
Oh,
And then
sorry.
Eli.
Yeah, it affected him for sure. Just in that, because yeah, he wrote this in like 1882, I think. So predating a lot of
Yeah.
his work, you know,
On
like,
varieties of religious
varieties
experience,
of
yeah.
religious experience. So he like took a lot of that with him, and also he talks in it about how before this he had always looked at like Hegelian philosophy in a really like sort of skeptical.
Hegelianism is a kind of idealism, that everything is unified. Actually, that ties in nicely with a lot of the commonalities of religious experiences across cultures, across religions, that you find unifying. That's a key term. You find a kind of sense in which it all makes sense now. Alas, once I try to use language to clarify what that experience was, I find it ineffective.
Yeah, and it's like the unifying of opposites too. That was a big
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, he
thing
says,
for.
what's a mistake
Yeah.
but a kind of take?
Oh, you found it.
Nausea, but a kind of nausea. Sober, drunk, astonishment, agreement, disagreement, emotion, motion, reconciliation of opposites, sober, drunk, all at the same time. Good and evil reconciled in a laugh, but it escapes. And then he says, but, and then like a pause, what escapes? What escapes? so he's obviously tripping on something.
And then a beat comes in the background, and you've got that's lyrical in a way. And again, by the way, you don't have to have that, and you can seek it out. People do engage. In fact, I have a number of examples of this. Do I have that coming up next? No, I don't. Is it here? Oh man, there's a lot of questions I have, but you have these slides available to you. I want to jump to them. Yeah, there it is. Drugs. These are mystical helpers. They're still passive when it happens to us. I may be able to put myself into the position, analogous to Pascal saying, fake it till you make it, to use that slogan. I can actively choose to put myself into this position where this belief may come about and become genuine. I can join a laugh group, and that laughter then is fake, but it can become genuine. I can take drugs, and those drugs may lead to affecting my biology, to lead to certain kinds of experiences that in the mundane experience world I can't have. The question, as you asked earlier, Jackson, was quite a nice one. Why is our biology such that? Why is our physical construction such that when you manipulate it in these ways, it can give rise to these experiences? Alex, did you have?
Yeah, I was just, sorry to go back, but
There's a lot of other ones.
Just for the transient, that's just to mean that it like changes you a lot.
No, sorry. That's short lasting. It only lasts for a short bit,
Okay.
as opposed to long lasting.
Then what is-
As opposed to like this mundane experience now, this dull, mundane, everyday experience that we're having now, it lasts all day. The sacred, uncanny religious experience is like a lightning bolt. It's short lasting and it stays with you. But it's completely separate and different and distinguished from the everyday.
Okay.
That's what transient means.
I thought that's what you meant by passive.
Passive means it's happening to you. Here, James points out, I can actively engage in these kinds of helpers. And they could be as mundane helpers as incense. There are lots of examples of these. And NPR has an interesting story of some of this. Or chanting in music, prayer, meditation. Dostoevsky, famous for having epilepsy, we'll look at a case of a person who suffers epilepsy, but sees that epileptic seizures as a kind of key to open up an insight into the world. Dostoevsky said that very thing, that it was extremely painful, but it gave him insights into the world that he would not otherwise, he claims, have had. And it's fascinating to think about this. What role does science have, should have, in dealing with people who have, for example, epileptic fits? Should they intervene and stop them? On the face of it, yes, it seems obvious if we can, but then what avenues toward knowledge, noetic experiences, are we potentially shutting off? Which is what I want to get to now. I'm not sure which I want to start with. Oh, there's the God helmet. That is actually a helmet that's in vogue. You put it on, and there are electrical currents. There's a lot more to it. You can look on these sites to investigate that. The question I'm asking with this example is, if we can facilitate through pure physical means, just mere electrical signals, a kind of religious experience in an individual, what does that mean about religious experiences? And I think it goes back to your question here. If I have a natural explanation for something, why invoke a supernatural explanation? And religious experiences typically are a supernatural explanation when, what is that principle? Occam's razor tells us we ought to go with a simpler explanation. Razor. Yes?
Did this philosopher know about like the Rastafarian religion?
The person who did this? Who made the God helmet? It's called the Koran helmet initially. I think then they called it the God. I think a reporter called it the God helmet. Well, yes, at least with respect to a lot of these elements, you see that with Rastafarianism, right? But you had more go on with it?
Well, I was just wondering, because it's like, like the use of drugs and stuff is highly used in that religion.
In many religions.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And so is it that would take out all the like passiveness of a religion? Like
No, James doesn't think so.
No?
He would consider them helpers, and in the way that Pascal would consider choosing to do certain things to eventually get to genuine belief. Doing things that will facilitate the potentiality of opening up my mind, right? I mean, why do people take drugs? To make them happy, to put it in the most broad terms. And I'll come back to that with Marx, of course. There's many reasons for it, right? And some reasons it's an addiction. And how that addiction started, of course, is relevant. Others, it's simply to kind of expand your mind. A lot of philosophers think that the best philosophy happens at the beer halls, at the pubs. I don't know if that's accurate. But that at least it releases inhibitions, which may be relevant with respect to being open to different kinds of experiences. There are other approaches to this. There are other kinds of explanations that are purely biological in nature. And I do want to show some of this, because her TED, has anyone seen this TED Talk by any chance?
Yeah.
Nobody?
Brain surgeon one?
Yeah. She's extremely eloquent on this, and I think it's worth watching. Even if it's going to put us back a little bit, I think it's worth watching this. Let me see. What's wrong here? Okay. So I'll still explain it. I think this is right. I don't know if we can watch all of it.
I grew up to study the brain because I have a brother who has been diagnosed with a brain disorder, schizophrenia. And as a sister, and later as a scientist, I wanted to understand, why is it that I can take my dreams, I can connect them to my reality, and I can make my dreams come true? What is it about my brother's brain and his schizophrenia that he cannot connect his dreams to a common and shared reality, so they instead become delusion? So I dedicated my career to research into the severe mental illnesses. And I moved from my home state of Indiana to Boston, where I was working in the lab of Dr. Francine Bennis in the Harvard Department of Psychiatry. And in the lab, we were asking the question, what are the biological differences between the brains of individuals who would be diagnosed as normal control, as compared with the brains of individuals diagnosed with schizophrenia, schizoaffective, or bipolar disorder? So we were essentially mapping the microcircuitry of the brain. Which cells are communicating with which cells, with which chemicals, and then in what quantities of those chemicals. So there was a lot of meaning in my life, because I was performing this type of research during the day. But then in the evenings and on the weekends, I traveled as an advocate for NAMI, the National Alliance on Mental Illness. But on the morning of December 10, 1996, I woke up to discover that I had a brain disorder of my own. A blood vessel exploded in the left half of my brain. And in the course of 4 hours, I watched my brain completely deteriorate in its ability to process all information. On the morning of the hemorrhage, I could not walk, talk, read, write, or recall any of my life. I essentially became an infant in a woman's body. If you've ever seen a human brain, it's obvious that the two hemispheres are completely separate from one another. And I have brought for you a real human brain. Thank you.
It's the putting the gloves on that makes it kind of, why does she have to do that?
So this is a real human brain. This is the front of the brain, the back of the brain with the spinal cord hanging down. And this is how it would be positioned inside of my head. And when you look at the brain, it's obvious that the two cerebral cortices are completely separate from one another. For those of you who understand computers, our right hemisphere functions like a parallel processor, while our left hemisphere functions like a serial processor. The two hemispheres do communicate with one another through the corpus callosum, which is made up of some 300 million axonal fibers. But other than that, the two hemispheres are completely separate. Because they process information differently, each of our hemispheres think about different things, they care about different things, and dare I say, they have very different personalities. Excuse me. Thank you. It's been a joy. Our right human hemisphere is all about this present moment. It's all about right here, right now. Our right hemisphere, it thinks in pictures, and it learns kinesthetically through the movement of our bodies. Information in the form of energy streams in simultaneously through all of our sensory systems, and then it explodes into this enormous collage of what this present moment looks like, what this present moment smells like and tastes like, what it feels like, and what it sounds like. I am an energy being connected to the energy all around me through the consciousness of my right hemisphere. We are energy beings connected to one another through the consciousness of our right hemispheres as one human family. And right here, right now, we are brothers and sisters on this planet, here to make the world a better place.
So this is a brain scientist, a tough-minded, in James's language, materialist, using language that sounds very tender-minded, does it not? Very similar to religious language that is yes-saying, that is unifying, that is everything is interconnected. You see this in Buddhism as well. In fact, her language gets even more Buddhist, if you will, when you look at when she uses the word nirvana, in fact. And we'll see why she uses that. As this video, and I do want to show a little bit of the next one as well, are playing, consider your reading of Marx and Freud. How might a Marxist or a Freudian respond? These are primarily scientific accounts, but that may not, that fact may not matter with respect to our responses to them. So consider those readings as you go through this.
And in this moment, we are perfect, we are whole, and we are beautiful. My left hemisphere, our left hemisphere, is a very different place. Our left hemisphere thinks linearly and methodically. Our left hemisphere is all about the past, and it's all about the future. Our left hemisphere is designed to take that enormous collage of the present moment and start picking out details, and more details about those details. It then categorizes and organizes all that information, associates it with everything in the past we've ever learned, and projects into the future all of our possibilities. And our left hemisphere thinks in language. It's that ongoing brain chatter that connects me and my internal world to my external world. It's that little voice that says to me, hey, you got to remember to pick up bananas on your way home. I need them in the morning. It's that calculating intelligence that reminds me when I have to do my laundry. But perhaps most important, it's that little voice that says to me, I am. I am. And as soon as my left hemisphere says to me, I am, I become separate. I become a single, solid individual, separate from the energy flow around me and separate from you. And this is the portion of my brain that I lost on the morning of my stroke. On the morning of the stroke, I woke up to a pounding pain behind my left eye. And it was the kind of pain, caustic pain, that you get when you bite into ice cream. And it just gripped me. And then it released me. And then it just gripped me. And then it released me. And it was very unusual for me to ever experience any kind of pain. So I thought, okay, I'll just start my normal routine. So I got up and I jumped onto my cardio glider, which is a full body, full exercise machine. And I'm jamming away on this thing. And I'm realizing that my hands look like primitive claws grasping onto the bar. And I thought, that's very peculiar. And I looked down at my body and I thought, whoa, I'm a weird looking thing. And it was as though my consciousness had shifted away from my normal perception of reality, where I'm the person on the machine having the experience, to some esoteric space where I'm witnessing myself having this experience. And it was all very peculiar, and my headache was just getting worse, so I get off the machine, and I'm walking across my living room floor, and I realize that everything inside of my body has slowed way down. And every step is very rigid and very deliberate. There's no fluidity to my pace, and there's this constriction in my area of perception, so I'm just focused on internal systems. And I'm standing in my bathroom getting ready to step into the shower, and I could actually hear the dialogue inside of my body. I heard a little voice saying, okay, you muscles, you got to contract, and you muscles, you relax. And then I lost my balance, and I'm propped up against the wall. And I looked down at my arm, and I realized that I can no longer define the boundaries of my body. I can't define where I begin and where I end, because the atoms and the molecules of my arm blended with the atoms and molecules of the wall. And all I could detect was this energy. And I'm asking myself, what is wrong with me? What is going on? And in that moment, my brain chatter, my left hemisphere brain chatter, went totally silent. Just like someone took a remote control and pushed the mute button. Total silence. And at first I was shocked to find myself inside of a silent mind. But then I was immediately captivated by the magnificence of the energy around me. And because I could no longer identify the boundaries of my body, I felt enormous and expansive. I felt at one with all the energy that was, and it was beautiful there. And then all of a sudden, my left hemisphere comes back online, and it says to me, hey, we got a problem, we got to get some help. And I'm going, oh, I got a problem. So it's like, okay, I got a problem. But then I immediately drifted right back out into the consciousness. And I affectionately refer to this space as La La Land. But it was beautiful there. Imagine what it would be like to be totally disconnected from your brain chatter that connects you to the external world. So here I am in this space, and my job and any stress related to my job, it was gone. And I felt lighter in my body. And imagine all of the relationships in the external world and any stressors related to any of those, they were gone. And I felt this sense of peacefulness. And imagine what it would feel like to lose 37 years of emotional baggage. Oh, I felt euphoria. It was beautiful there. And then again, my left hemisphere comes online and it says, hey, you've got to pay attention. We've got to get help. And I'm thinking, I got to get help. I got to focus. So I get out of the shower and I'm mechanically dressed. And I'm walking around my apartment and I'm thinking, I got to get to work. Can I drive? And in that moment, my right arm went totally paralyzed by my side. Then I realized, oh my gosh, I'm having a stroke. And then the next thing my brain says to me is, wow, this is so cool. How many brain scientists have the opportunity to study their own brain from the inside out? And then it crosses my mind, but I'm a very busy woman. I don't have time for a stroke. It's like, okay, I can't stop the stroke from happening, so I'll do this for a week or two, and then I'll get back to my routine. Okay, so I got to call help. I got to call work. I couldn't remember the number at work. So I remembered in my office I had a business card with my number on it. So I go into my business room. I pull out a 3-inch stack of business cards. And I'm looking at the card on top. And even though I could see clearly in my mind's eye what my business card looked like, I couldn't tell if this was my card or not, because all I could see were pixels. And the pixels of the words blended with the pixels of the background and the pixels of the symbols, and I just couldn't tell. And then I would wait for what I call a wave of clarity. And in that moment, I would be able to reattach to normal reality. And I could tell, that's not the card, that's not the card, that's not the card. It took me 45 minutes to get 1 inch down inside of that stack of cards. In the meantime, for 45 minutes, the hemorrhage is getting bigger in my left hemisphere. I do not understand numbers. I do not understand the telephone, but it's the only plan I have. So I take the phone pad and I put it right here. I take the business card, I put it right here, and I'm matching the shape of the squiggles on the card to the shape of the squiggles on the phone pad. But then I would drift back out into La La Land and not remember if when I come back if I'd already dialed those numbers. So I had to wield my paralyzed arm like a stump and cover the numbers as I went along and pushed them so that as I would come back to normal reality, I'd be able to tell, yes, I've already dialed that number. Eventually, the whole number gets dialed, and I'm listening to the phone, and my colleague picks up the phone and he says to me, and I think to myself, oh my gosh, he sounds like a golden retriever. And so I say to him, clear in my mind, I say to him, this is Jill, I need help. And what comes out of my my voice is, and I think, oh my gosh, I sound like a golden retriever. So I didn't know that I couldn't speak or understand language until I tried. So he recognizes that I need help, and he gets me help. And a little while later, I'm riding in an ambulance from one hospital across Boston to Mass General Hospital, and I curl up into a little fetal ball, and just like a balloon, with the last bit of air just right out of the balloon, I just felt my energy lift, and I felt my spirit surrender. And in that moment, I knew that I was no longer the choreographer of my life, and either the doctors rescue my body and give me a second chance at life, or this was perhaps my moment of transition. When I woke later that afternoon, I was shocked to discover that I was still alive. When I felt my spirit surrender, I said goodbye to my life, and my mind was now suspended between two very opposite planes of reality. Stimulation coming in through my sensory systems felt like pure pain. Light burned my brain like wildfire, and sounds were so loud and chaotic that I could not pick a voice out from the background noise, and I just wanted to escape. Because I could not identify the position of my body in space, I felt enormous and expansive, like a genie just liberated from her bottle. And my spirit soared free like a great whale gliding through a sea of silent euphoria. Nirvana. I found nirvana. I remember thinking there's no way I would ever be able to squeeze the enormousness of myself back inside this tiny little body. But then I realized, but I'm still alive. I'm still alive, and I have found nirvana. And if I have found nirvana and I'm still alive, then everyone who is alive can find nirvana. And I pictured a world filled with beautiful, peaceful, compassionate, loving people who knew that they could come to this space at any time, and that they could purposely choose to step to the right of their left hemispheres and find this peace. And then I realized what a tremendous gift this experience could be. What a stroke of insight this could be to how we live our lives. And it motivated me to recover. 2.5 weeks after the hemorrhage, the surgeons went in and they removed a blood clot the size of a golf ball that was pushing on my language centers. Here I am with my mama, who's a true angel in my life. It took me 8 years to completely recover. So, who are we? We are the life force power of the universe with manual dexterity and 2 cognitive minds. And we have the power to choose moment by moment who and how we want to be in the world. Right here, right now, I can step into the consciousness of my right hemisphere where I am the life force power of the universe. I am the life force power of the 50 trillion beautiful molecular geniuses that make up my form, at one with all that is. Or I can choose to step into the consciousness of my left hemisphere, where I become a single individual, a solid, separate from the flow, separate from you. I am Dr. Jill Bolte-Taylor, intellectual, neuroanatomist. These are the we inside of me. Which would you choose? Which do you choose? And when? I believe that the more time we spend choosing to run the deep inner peace circuitry of our right hemispheres, the more peace we will project into the world. and the more peaceful our planet will be. And I thought that was an idea worth spreading.
All right. Lot in that. What questions have you about that? What comments do you have about that? Had anyone seen that before? I thought some people might have. You'd seen it before, yeah? It's fairly powerful, I think.
It's very tender-minded.
Tender-minded. And what's interesting about that is that she had visited Rockford, where I used to live, and one of my colleagues went to her talk. I'll get your question 1 second, sorry. And he asked her, he was in the theology department, he taught religions, and he asked her in the Q&A afterwards about the religious language that she uses, right? Because she's clearly using religious language there, and whether or not she herself was religious or became religious because of this experience. And she said no to both of those, that she had no background in religion. She is, to James's distinction, tender versus hard-headed, so to speak, a brain scientist, a neurological basis for the origins of these kinds of experiences. Now, what are the consequences of this? What does that mean? What responses do we have with respect to how we explain these experiences? And does it matter that we find some explanation that may be neurobiological in nature, that may be genealogical, historical in nature, as Marx will say, and maybe psychological and also historical and political, as Freud would say? What does it matter? I want those questions to be in the back of your minds as we go through this. Yes, and then yes.
Could it be said that, like, she was talking about how the right and the left brain have two completely different personalities? And so could it be said that, like, for example, the left brain is more tough-minded and the right brain is more tender-minded?
Yes, I think that's a fair point. Sorry, let me get rid of this commercial. And isn't that interesting? This will take us to the brief section I want to show here. This is from The Secrets of the Mind on interview with Villainy or V.S. Ramachandran, who's pictured here in his youth. And this, the next character, not this person here, has a cerebral epileptic seizures. And that's presumably because of too much cross-talk between the two hemispheres. And the way that she describes it, and again, it's fascinating to have what seems to be an intermingling of religious experience language with from a brain scientist. So there is an interesting link. And speaking of links, you've got the corpus callosum that links the left and the right hemisphere. And when they communicate, the communication is oftentimes so tight that we don't recognize, and we don't, in her language, experience the interconnectedness and the oneness of all, which is the right brain. The right brain is unconcerned with difference, unconcerned with identity, unconcerned with me versus you and mine versus yours. This is the Buddhist and by the way, one can get these experiences without having to have a stroke. Likewise, one can get to have these thoughts that we'll see in the next one without having epileptic seizures. In fact, one of the person says something about his son getting all philosophical after his epileptic seizures. You don't have to have a seizure to get philosophical. But why is it? Another question back to James and to Alston. Why is it that these experiences happen so rarely? And go ahead to your further follow.
Kind of related, I just noticed that, like, a lot of these things, it's kind of like, in some ways, creating damage to your physical body. So to have, like, a spiritual experience, does that mean you need to, in some way, have a certain deterioration of your physical self to kind of escape that and, kind of reach that other higher level of being?
Yeah. Certainly Socrates would say so. In fact, he says famously, the point of philosophy is to learn how to die, which means to get rid of your physical encumbrance, the prison of your body. And drug use and other kind of meditative practices are, in a sense, a way of controlling the body and controlling the mind. And that's the hardest thing to do, is to control the thoughts that are going through your head. And oftentimes meditation is an attempt to do that very thing, to quell or quiet the mind and the body without necessarily doing damage to it. So this is why meditation oftentimes has positive effects, whereas there are very few effects that are positive of having a stroke. Except for in her particular case, that's why she names the book My Stroke of Insight, which is a clever pun I hope you all got. But that's an interesting idea. The diminishment of the body could lead to the, what's a better word? What's the opposite of diminishment? The elevation? I don't know. The raising of the mind, the soul, the self. Let me get another question. I thought I did. Go ahead.
Yeah. So James and like pragmatists would say that the TED Talk was, it doesn't matter whether or not it was her religious experience because it affected her life in a specific way. Like because she benefited from it, or like she took stuff away from it, like that's what matters.
Yeah, that's a tough one. Because it surely did damage to her. Nevertheless, the kinds of experiences that she was forced into, certainly passive, she argues in her book that we can work on being more creative. We can work on focusing on that right hemisphere of our brain in a way that, again, doesn't require all of these other required damage done to us. We can work on seeing ourselves as interdependent. In fact, that's one of what nirvana literally means is no-thingness. When you achieve enlightenment in Buddhism, you recognize the interdependency of everything. This is the language that she's talking about. Meditative adepts are able to achieve, from their accounts, achieve a state of whole interdependence, where I do not recognize the difference between me and others. And from the Buddhist perspective, that theological, religious idea is metaphysical in nature, but it's also ethical. Because why would I want to harm another if I'm intimately connected with them? I'm harming myself. You see the ethical dilemma, ethical connections. And with Ramachandran, who we're going to get to in a moment, he has amazingly interesting views on something called mirror neurons. So there's a neurological basis for our interdependency, at least in our brains, that give us, at least the right hemisphere, show us as interconnected. And the mirror neurons are those neurons in our brain, in our motor cortex, that activate when we see people doing goal-directed behavior. And they activate as if it's us doing it. The brain, to borrow from Ramachandran, he says this explicitly, the neurons in my brain do not know the difference between my body and the body of the other person. What I mean by that is, if I see somebody else getting harmed and in pain, kicked or whatever, neurons in my motor cortex activate as if it were my body. And that the origins of empathy might come into play there. And the interesting connections between Buddhism, nirvana, mirror neurons, and religious experiences generally, and our conception and sense of self, I think is a fascinating overlapping between them. Let me get a couple more hands. Did you have more to say before? So, Jackson, and then I'll come back.
Yeah, so she mentions the parallel versus the serial of like right and left. It seems like with the Opium of the Masses reading, it's really a critique of serial-minded religion. It's like I'm reading this other book it says, probably why so many people resist contemplation to begin with, because it feels more like the shedding of thoughts in general than attaining new or good ones. I mean, there's a lot of shedding in her experience there. It feels more like just letting go than accomplishing anything, which is counterintuitive for our naturally capitalistic minds, which I think what they're saying.
Wait, what is that?
It's The Universal Christ by Richard Rohr.
Okay.
He's a friar, he's a monk.
Okay.
And he's like a mystic. And I think that sounds right. It's like when we get so caught up in that one side of our mind, it's really all about attaining and less of this
for the individual, for me, separate from you.
Yeah.
No, that's a good analysis. I'm interested in that. Like that sentence right there certainly connects with Marx.
Yeah.
That was very well connected there. Yeah.
I was just thinking with the interdependence and the distinction between, this, like the self as like an object, and then there being like this outside world and being like sort of separate from it.
So self is a subject, and then everything else objects.
Yeah, exactly. But then And so there's obviously parallels with, like dependent or origination in Buddhism and stuff, but it also really reminded me of the master-slave dialectic too.
This is twice you're bringing up Hegel. Hegel is a incomprehensible philosopher along with Husserl and Heidegger, all people whose last name starts with H. The argument is stay the hell away from them. I'm sorry. Hegel is going to influence Feuerbach, who's going to influence Marx. So there's a connection. It's all interconnected. And eventually we'll get to Kevin Bacon.
But the idea of the self being conceived through socially, essentially, like through the perception, your perception of being perceived.
Oh, okay.
Yeah, she says when she goes back to focusing on the left side of the mind, she says, I'm an intellectual, I am a neuro and anatomist. It's like you get to choose which one will you.
Exactly, and that your idea of yourself is based on your idea of what other people think of you, so it connects to empathy as well, because
that's a good point.
You can think the root of empathy maybe stems from this other, from more like a fear of how the other is conceiving of you, or like some bigger other.
An odd notion of empathy then, because.
But you want to be able to know what other people are.
Yes,
feeling.
And it may, from an evolutionary standpoint, to get to Freud in particular, that would make sense. It's not necessarily a positive thing, like, oh, I'm so empathetic. Oh, that's very caring of you. Well, not really. I'm empathetic for my own benefit, which evolutionarily that may make sense. But I think we don't want to get too deeply into that yet, because that may oversimplify at least Freud's conception. Because Freud's conception of religion and presumably empathy that may be apart to the extent that it is, Freud has a very negative view of religion. And he would look at experiences like this as being purely pathological, which takes me to the next reading. I'm sorry, to the next video, which we'll show. This is from Secrets of the Mind. We're going to have a little bit of time here. And in it, the description of it, and Ramachandra's talking about it, and the role that science plays and should play or should not play with respect to the potential for religious experience and potential enlightenment or mere delusion. Keep those questions in the back of your mind as we watch this.
How crucial emotions are to the recognition process of the normal brain.
That's San Diego, I think, is where this is taking place.
But what would happen if the emotions were to run out of control? What effect might an excess of emotion have on the way we interpret the world? John Sharon has temporal lobe epilepsy.
The seizures involve my person and my soul and my spirit, all of it. When I get one of those feelings, like my whole body just tingles and just, I'm like, that's that.
John's epileptic seizures are essentially an electrical storm in his temporal lobes, when a group of neurons starts firing at random, out of sync with the rest of his brain. Recently, John experienced one of his worst episodes to date. He'd gone out to the desert with a girlfriend, and they both got very drunk, with disastrous results. John was suddenly hit by a volley of seizures. Each one lasted about 5 minutes and involved violent convulsions that left him unconscious. Eventually, John managed to get a call through to his father, who drove out to the desert to bring him home.
On the way home, him and I just got into some philosophical, questions about everything, and I just would not shut up. Once I got on the way home, I was going and going. It was like I was wired.
It's basically an earthquake within the body. And like any earthquake, there are aftershocks. And like any earthquake that does damage, things have to be rebuilt. Things have to subside. Mainly what I deal with is the aftermath, particularly with this last episode. It was very much like stepping into a Salvador Dali painting. Okay, instantly everything was surreal. And that's, in essence, what his seizures are all about, the aftermath. Where it puts his brain, where it puts his memory, where it puts his mind, his thinking ability, everything else.
When John's seizures came to an end, he was exhausted, but he felt omnipotent.
Was
I
omnipotent
went
mean?
running down the street screaming that I was God. And then this guy came out and I was just like pelvic thrust at him and his wife, and I was like, "You want to effing bet I ain't God?"
And I said, literally, you get back in here.
He said asshole.
What do you think you're doing? You know, you're disturbing the neighbors, you're gonna call the cops. What is this all about?
I kind of just looked at him cool and calm and apologized to him, and I'm like, "Nah, no one's gonna call the police." Like, I didn't say this last part, but I'm thinking to myself, no one's gonna call the police on God.
John had never been religious, yet the onset of his seizures triggered overwhelming spiritual feelings.
It has been known for a long time that some patients with seizures originating in the temporal lobes have intense religious auras, intense experience of God visiting them. Sometimes it's a personal God, sometimes it's a more diffuse feeling of being one with the cosmos. Everything seems suffused with meaning. The patient will say, "Finally, I see what it's all really about, doctor. I really understand God."
This is exactly, almost word for word, what James describes in his varieties of religious experience. It all makes sense now, a sudden kind of illuminative experience. Again, a noetic quality that's more accessible to that individual, more obviously true than any of the mundane experiences. That's V.S. Ramachandran, by the way, who we've mentioned.
I understand my place in the universe, in the cosmic scheme. Why does this happen? And why does it happen so often in patients with temporal lobe seizures?
Ramachandran met John shortly after the episode in the desert. He was still feeling the extreme highs and lows that follow his seizures. Ramachandran was about to witness the emotional intensity that John endures.
I've been in so much pain that I'd rather be shot to death, or just whipped to death.
But also joy?
Yeah, I've been in so much joy that I would rather be left alone. Take everything away and just let me sit there and have that much joy. I feel like I can float and stuff sometimes, you know. It's like the best.
There were times where he would have 7 or 8 grand mal seizures in a day. He would never come back to this reality during that time. I have looked in his eyes in those times, and I have seen a cry for help.
No, I mean, you guys, that's the thing, though. A lot of other people can just walk around and see the beauty of the world. I can... Sorry. It's not as beautiful.
So that's the ineffable quality that James is talking about.
He has a seizure, he'll want to talk philosophy.
Again, we covered that. You don't have to have a
He'll want to
seizure.
discuss all the things that are floating around in this stew he's got up here that he's trying to reconstruct. Thoughts that he may have had just floating through his mind while he was in a seizure mode may come surfacing.
I see, okay.
Okay, so...
But also you said he's become more emotional because of the seizure, so that's helpful too.
Much more sensitive, but oddly enough, not in regards to himself, okay? But in regards to atrocities, disasters, things like that, anywhere and everywhere. Wrongs done to other people.
Oh my God. And you know what? I am so right in my own head, I know I could go out there and get people to follow me. Not like these wackos with sheets on their heads. Not like those idiots. Right?
Well, they show that poor guy there.
Bad timing of the prophets. And were all the prophets people that were flopping around on the ground? Is that what this whole message was? The gift from the gods this whole time?
That's possible, isn't it? Yeah.
I've never been religious, ever. People say, no, you can't see into the future. That's what that gift is, but you gotta pay for it by getting slammed around.
Now, why do these patients have intense religious experiences when they have these seizures? And why do they become preoccupied with theological and religious matters even in between seizures? One possibility is that the seizure activity in the temporal lobe somehow creates all kinds of odd, strange emotions in the person's mind, in the person's brain. And this welling up of bizarre emotions may be interpreted by the patient as visits from another world, or as God is visiting them. Maybe that's the only way he can make sense of this welter of strange emotions going on in his brain. Another possibility is that this has something to do with the way in which the temporal lobes are wired up to deal with the world emotionally. As we walk around and interact with the world, you need some way of determining what's important, what's emotionally salient, and what's relevant to you versus something trivial or unimportant. How does this come about? We think what's critical is the connections between the sensory areas in the temporal lobes and the amygdala, which is the gateway to the emotional centers in the brain. The strength of these connections is what determines how emotionally salient something is. And therefore you could speak of a sort of emotional salience landscape with hills and valleys corresponding to what's important and what's not important. And each of us has a slightly different emotional salience landscape. Now consider what happens in temporal lobe epilepsy. When you have repeated seizures, what might be going on is an indiscriminate strengthening of all these pathways. It's a bit like water flowing down rivulets along the cliff surface. When it rains repeatedly, there's an increasing tendency for the water to make furrows along one pathway, and this progressive deepening of the furrows artificially raises the emotional significance of some categories of inputs. So instead of just finding lions and tigers and mothers emotionally salient, he finds everything deeply salient. For example, a grain of sand, a piece of driftwood, seaweed. All of this becomes imbued with deep significance. Now this tendency to ascribe cosmic significance to everything around you might be akin to what we call a mystical experience or a religious experience.
For Ramachandran, John's story is the basis of one of his most intriguing and controversial theories. Could there be a specialized area of the brain that drives human beings to seek religion?
A few years ago, the popular press inaccurately quoted me as having claimed that there is a God center or a G-spot in the temporal lobes. Now this is complete nonsense. There is no specific area in the temporal lobe concerned with God, but it's possible there are parts of the temporal lobes whose activity is somehow conducive to religious belief. Now, this seems unlikely, but it might be true. Now, why might we have neural machinery in the temporal lobes for belief in religion? Well, belief in religion is widespread. Every tribe, every society has some form of religious worship. And maybe the reason it evolved, if it did evolve, is that it is conducive to the stability of society.
Who does that sound like? Freud.
And this may be easiest if you believe in some sort of supreme being. And that may be one reason why religious sentiments evolve in the brain.
The only reason I probably would get rid of the seizures and epilepsy, because I've never even seen them, is because of my family. because of him. I would keep them for those visions because of the way I see the world falling into place and things like that. It's a wild little place to be stuck in there. But it also seems like a key, and right now I haven't learned how to get to the key use the key without those seizures. If I was told that I would never have a chance to have that key again, sorry, I'm going to hold on to that thing.
Just because some patients with temporal lobe seizures have intense religious experiences, this does not in any way invalidate that experience for that patient. In fact, it can very often enrich the patient's life enormously, and it poses a dilemma very often for the physician, because what right do we have to treat the patient with medication or with surgery, thereby in some instances depriving him of these valuable experiences? To me, the exciting thing is that subjects like God and religion can now be actually addressed by us scientists. We can begin to ask questions about religion and God and begin to approach these questions by listening to these patients, by talking with them, and by studying them.
It's a tragic irony that today's breakthroughs in our understanding of the human brain are made possible by the misfortune of brain injury. For centuries, philosophers have labored to understand God, consciousness, and the mysteries of human nature. Now, perhaps science will have its chance.
Oh, yeah. Thank you very much. I did choose a good video. So, a number of questions. We'll have to end with this. Is it science job to nose into this? Should they? What could we gain from it? Or does it only pose more problems than it might solutions? And of course, to tie into the first half of class next time, how does it, if at all, this scientific explanation, attempt at an explanation, which may appeal to Occam's razor, connect with a Freudian or a Marxist critique of religion? And Marx and Freud have different views. I'll just end with this. Freud's views of religion, far more skeptical and negative than are Marx's. I think Marx gets misconstrued. Religion's the opium of the people, and that's it. There's a lot more to that quotation that is almost always left out. The opium of the masses is a kind of drug, but it's the drug and religion in this case are both similar in that they are merely symptoms of underlying problems. And they're both attempts at addressing underlying problems. Marx is an atheist like Freud, but Marx's conception of religion is more of lack of interest ultimately in it as something that is the problem. Freud sees it as a delusion, as potentially damaging. We'll begin the first half of class on that next time. And in relation to that, we're going to get into religious pluralism. That is to say, what does it mean that there are multiple approaches to religion? And this will then transition from religious experiences. And the question will be related to, why is it that the religious experiences seem to vary in particular cultural ways, religious ways? Does that mean that there are multiple paths to the same summit, to put it in one way? Or are there absolute contradictions, inconsistencies among religions, such that there is only one right way? Those are the kinds of discussions we'll have next week. I will keep up with the readings. I will see you all then. Take care.